The sound of American laughter, previously introduced, was more than just noise. It was a fundamental cultural friction, an abrasive reality against the highly polished surface of the Japanese military psyche. The captured women, drawn from organizations like the Joshi Teishintai Women's Volunteer Corps, or serving as nurses and administrative staff, were steeped in the doctrine of Gaman endurance, self-control, and the stoic suppression of emotion. In the rigid hierarchy of Imperial Japan, the expression of casual joy or relief was often seen as frivolous, even dangerous, distracting from the solemn duty to the emperor and the state. Battle, and certainly defeat, demanded somber, disciplined silence. The American guards, however, moved with an unsettling ease. Their conversations were punctuated by back-and-forth banter, non-essential remarks about the weather, complaints about the heat, or fleeting mentions of home details that held no place in the pressurized atmosphere of the Japanese wartime experience. The POW women, observing from behind barbed wire or makeshift enclosures, meticulously catalogued these behaviors. They noticed the way a sergeant might good-naturedly tease a private about a missed shot, or how the men would erupt into brief, raucous peals of genuine merriment over something as trivial as a spilled cup of coffee. This ubiquity of lightheartedness defied the official Japanese narrative that the Americans were a nation of soft, morally bankrupt individuals whose focus on comfort and personal liberty made them unfit for the sacrifice of war. This was the core of the cognitive dissonance. If the Americans were truly weak and undisciplined, how could they have crossed the vast Pacific, island by bloody island, and now stand victorious in the heart of the Japanese defensive perimeter? The answer, as it slowly dawned on the prisoners, lay in the concept of democratic individuality. The American soldier was not an automaton. He was permitted, even encouraged, to retain his personal identity and sense of humor. This retention of self, the scriptural records show, was a source of great strength, not weakness. It allowed for a release of tension, a psychological resilience that contrasted sharply with the internalized, suppressed stress that characterized the Japanese frontline soldier, often driven to suicidal charges, banzai as the only honorable release from an untenable situation. The laughter was a safety valve. The stoicism was a pressure cooker. The recurring symbolism of the sea ration deepened its meaning here. It wasn't just food. It was a testament to the industrial scale of the American individual. Each can was perfectly sealed, designed for one man, containing not just sustenance, but small luxuries, a pack of cigarettes, sometimes chewing gum, or a chocolate bar. This contrasted with the communal, often meager gruel of the Japanese soldier, where individual supplies were secondary to the collective. The American military doctrine ensured that the individual fighting man was supplied, supported, and valued, enough to be kept fed, equipped, and yes, even entertained. The casual discard of a half-eaten sea ration was therefore not waste, but the visible signature of a nation whose capacity for production was so immense that it could treat the essentials of survival with nonchalance. This was the material embodiment of the democratic ethos, respecting the individual enough to provide for them overwhelmingly. The Japanese prisoners, products of an empire of enforced scarcity and collective denial, watched this display of individual abundance and began to question the very basis of their sacrifice. The historical context surrounding the capture of these women in the Philippines was saturated with an intensity rarely seen even in the brutality of the Pacific War. By January 1945, the Japanese High Command had fully embraced the concept of total war, a doctrine that obliterated the distinction between combatant and civilian auxiliary. Every Japanese subject was expected to contribute to the war effort until death. For the women auxiliaries, this meant a deeper level of ideological saturation. They were seen as the moral backbone, ensuring the purity and determination of the fighting men. Their expectation of treatment was therefore colored by the behavior of their own forces towards Allied prisoners and local populations, a cycle of dehumanization that they projected onto their captors. The first profound shock came in the realm of medical treatment. Japanese medical practices during the war, particularly in field conditions, often prioritized the immediate return of a soldier to combat over his long-term well-being, and treatment of enemy prisoners was typically non-existent or barbaric. The captured women, many of whom were wounded or suffering from tropical diseases and malnutrition, were instead brought to hastily converted American field hospitals. The clinical records from the 36th Evacuation Hospital and other units involved in the Philippine campaign illustrate this fact. Japanese women were treated alongside wounded American GIs, sometimes in the same wards. They received penicillin, plasma transfusions, and meticulous surgical care resources that were critically scarce for the Japanese forces still fighting. One documented account, later transcribed by American military psychologists, describes a woman paralyzed by shrapnel who witnessed an American surgeon pausing his work on a high-ranking officer to check on her minor wound, prioritizing the immediate threat. This adherence to the Geneva Convention standards, even for auxiliary personnel who technically fell into a grey area of combatant status, was incomprehensible. Their worldview, which demanded that the enemy be utterly despised and subjected to suffering, crumbled under the weight of this simple, methodical medical professionalism. The Americans were acting, not out of passion or hatred, but out of a cold, clinical standard of care that applied universally. The C ration can again became an inadvertent part of the medical narrative. Diet was crucial for recovery. While recovering, the women were given not just rice gruel, but the same supplementary, high-calorie food provided to American patients can fruit, concentrated soups, and high-protein biscuits. They observed the meticulous dating and tracking of every item, a bureaucratic obsession with quality control and consistent supply that spoke volumes. The Japanese military had long suffered from corruption and disastrous logistics, leading to the starvation of countless soldiers. To witness the conqueror's unwavering ability to provide high-quality, standardized sustenance, even to the defeated, was a testimony to the fundamental efficiency and humanity baked into the American logistical machine. It suggested that their strength was not simply spiritual zeal, but a pragmatic, well-governed infrastructure, the quiet engine of democracy. The transformation began when the fear of execution was replaced by the expectation of recovery. They were not viewed as objects of vengeance, but as medical cases. This shift in framing was perhaps the most powerful corrosive agent against the ingrained doctrine of American barbarism. The American system, by treating them as individuals with inherent physical worth, was silently, relentlessly dismantling the imperial ideology, which taught them their worth was purely defined by their utility to the state. They were being healed by the very system they were taught to believe would destroy them. The architecture of the holding camps itself provided another layer of profound, unsettling contrast. Unlike the austere, often deliberately cruel structures of Japanese prisoner camps, the American facilities, though temporary and utilitarian, were built with an eye toward minimal, yet consistent, decency. There were basic sanitation facilities, organized bathing areas, and most importantly, a structured routine. The American approach to confinement was guided by regulations and administrative procedures, not the capricious cruelty of individual guards. This reliance on the impersonal rule of law, or in this case, the codified military regulation, was alien to the Japanese perception of power, which often rested on the absolute authority of the senior individual officer and the rigid, unquestioning obedience of the subordinate. The women observed the meticulous adherence to duty rosters and supply inventories. The guards changed shifts at predictable times following protocols. The delivery of food, including the ubiquitous C ration can supplies, was accounted for and distributed according to established schedules. This demonstration of order without oppression was a revelation. It suggested that authority could be exercised without constant fear and random violence. In the Japanese system, discipline was often maintained through physical abuse and psychological intimidation, a culture of power where cruelty was not an exception, but a functional tool of command. One young nurse, recorded simply as SSK in the interrogation reports, spoke of the bewildering politeness of the American supply officers. They would formally check items of a manifest, often communicating with the Japanese administrative personnel, even if indirectly through an interpreter, with a dry, professional courtesy. This lack of overt hostility, this treatment of the vanquished as administrative counterparts rather than despised chattel, was a shock. It was the detached efficiency of a professional military, operating under constraints that applied even to the treatment of the enemy. Furthermore, the American use of interpreters was particularly instructive. These were often Japanese Americans Nisei, dressed in American uniforms, speaking perfect Japanese. The fact that the enemy nation could integrate and trust individuals of Japanese descent into its military establishment spoke volumes about the inclusivity and anti-racist foundation of American ideology, contrasting sharply with the rigidly racialized hierarchy of Imperial Japan. which viewed other Asian peoples with contempt. The Nisei soldiers, who often maintained a friendly but professional distance, served as living proof that the American system valued contribution and loyalty over purely racial or ethnic identity. The C-ration can, in this administrative context, became a symbol of systemic justice. Every prisoner, regardless of rank or sex, received the standardized ration. There was no distinction, no arbitrary withholding of sustenance based on a guard's mood or a prisoner's previous service. The ration was a right guaranteed by the American system, not a privilege granted by an individual. This equality in provision was a silent but forceful declaration of the value placed on every human life, even that of a defeated enemy. This bureaucratic fairness was an ethical statement, undermining the Japanese belief that the Americans were a chaotic, selfish, and ultimately unjust people. The predictable, regulated rhythm of the American camp was, ironically, a manifestation of a deeper moral order than the chaotic brutality of their own wartime experience. The emotional contrast was most acutely felt in the juxtaposition of American camaraderie with the internal strain of the Japanese prisoners. The American soldiers, despite the grueling war they had fought, maintained an easygoing, almost familiar relationship with one another. They were quick to share letters from home, photographs, and the simple comforts available to them. This collective spirit, however, was fundamentally horizontal, built on mutual respect and shared experience, not vertical and enforced through rigid rank and fare. The Japanese women, conversely, maintained the strict, unyielding hierarchy of their own social and military structures even in captivity. Seniority dictated everything: who stood where, who spoke when, and who received the meager internal favors they could negotiate. This internalized discipline meant constant, subtle internal tension, a fear of transgression against a peer or superior that persisted long after the external threat of their own command was gone. They were prisoners of the Americans, but also prisoners of their own cultural rigidity. The Americans' interactions with the male Japanese POWs, previously noted, were a particularly unnerving spectacle for the women. They witnessed American guards and defeated Japanese soldiers sharing the tedious labor of camp maintenance, sometimes pausing to share a joke about the task itself, or to exchange a piece of chewing gum and other small, symbolic luxury drawn from the endless supply of the C-ration can. This simple act of sharing a flavorless, transient pleasure transcended the immediate combat hatred. It implied a respect for the shared soldier's experience, a temporary truce in the human reality of conflict. One report detailed a young Japanese corporal, tasked with clearing debris, who accidentally dropped his shovel into a ditch. An American guard, instead of shouting or punishing the man, merely shook his head, sighed, and helped him retrieve it. There was no malice, only the pragmatic realization that they were both, for that moment, just men doing a dirty job. This absence of petty cruelty was the antithesis of the Japanese koshery training, which often used minor infractions as justification for severe, humiliating punishments. The observation transformed their perception of American softness. They realized the American system was not soft. It was confident. It was so secure in its position, its resources, and its fundamental moral grounding that it did not need to derive satisfaction from the suffering of the defeated. The casual laughter, the shared gum, the lack of vindictiveness, these were all products of a system that believed its strength was self-evident and required no theatrical demonstration of power. The ideological message was clear. The American soldier could afford to be kind because his nation was fundamentally abundant and free. The Japanese soldier, fighting for a starving, desperate empire, could not afford such a luxury. The transformation was the realization that true strength lies in security and capacity, not in fanaticism or fear. To fully grasp the magnitude of the Japanese women's confusion, one must understand the specific propaganda they consumed. The imperial narrative presented Americans as monstrous materialists, a nation focused solely on money and comfort, devoid of Bushido, the warrior's way, or spiritual depth. The American soldier was caricatured as a pampered coward who would flee at the sight of true spiritual resolve. Therefore, the physical evidence of American abundance was meant to signal moral failure. Yet, the American conduct in the POW camps presented a devastating paradox. They were materialists who demonstrated superior moral conduct. The physical manifestation of this materialism, the endless supplies, the excellent medical care, the standardized rations, was deployed not for self-indulgence, but for disciplined, humane purposes. The sea ration can become the physical argument against the propaganda. It was the product of a powerful industry. Yes, but that industry was marshaled to support a fighting force with unparalleled efficiency and, critically, unparalleled compassion toward the captured. The Japanese military, driven by a philosophy of Seishin spirit over matter, had deliberately neglected logistics, believing that pure willpower would overcome material deficiencies. The result was mass starvation and disease among their own troops. The American approach, however, demonstrated that material abundance, coupled with systematic organization, was the foundation of true spiritual confidence. They could afford to be humane because they had secured their material needs so completely. Factual records show that the Japanese women were particularly focused on the amount of water available. The Japanese troops in the Pacific often suffered from chronic dehydration and lack of potable water, a major factor in their combat effectiveness. American camps, even temporary ones, had meticulous systems for water purification and distribution. The soldiers used water with a casualness that stunned the prisoners for washing, for cooling engines, even for washing vehicles that were not strictly dirty. This was another small, constant demonstration of a resource so vast that it defied the logic of scarcity that governed their own lives. The transformation was the dawning realization that the Japanese propaganda had fundamentally misidentified the source of American strength. It was not a weak materialism, but a robust, democratically funded infrastructure that guaranteed the well-being of its people and its soldiers. This was a system that worked for the individual, not one that consumed the individual in the service of an abstract state. The kindness of the American guards, the fairness of the administrators, the abundance of the sea rations were all simply the visible human expression of an unrivaled national capacity, a capacity the Japanese Empire, with all its spiritual zeal, could not hope to match. This realization of vast, self-assured competence was far more terrifying than any expected cruelty. The element of symbolism continued to deepen through the auditory experience of the prisoners. Beyond the laughter, the women were exposed to the American phenomenon of the radio broadcast. While strictly controlled, the sounds filtering into the camp were often music, swing, jazz, and popular songs, music that spoke of romance, personal ambition, and leisure. This music, often played casually by the guards on portable sets, represented a society that was not entirely consumed by the war machine. The Japanese soldiers' sonic world was dominated by military marching music, summer patriotic anthems, and the rhythmic shouts of drill. Even their private songs often carried a theme of duty, sacrifice, or melancholic farewell. The American music, filled with syncopated rhythms and themes of individual pleasure, was shocking in its irreverence to the immediate environment of war. It suggested a profound connection to a thriving civilian life, a life that was continuing, vibrant, and confident back home. Entirely separate from the grim necessity of conflict, the women observed the guards listening to these broadcasts, sometimes humming along, sometimes dancing briefly in a private moment of relaxation. This signaled a degree of psychological separation between the soldier and the war, a permission to be human and retain ties to the culture of peace. It was a visible manifestation of democracy. The system was fighting the war, but it did not demand the complete spiritual annexation of the individual. The guard could fight ruthlessly one moment and enjoy a love song the next. This soundscape contrasted starkly with the absolute commitment demanded by the Japanese system, where the line between soldier and citizen dissolved entirely. For the Japanese women, the music was a sound of freedom, the freedom to be frivolous, the freedom to look past the current horror to a guaranteed future of peace and personal joy. It suggested a war fought not for the continuation of an ideology, but for the preservation of a way of life that included dancing and private happiness. The final piece of this cultural puzzle was the epistolary abundance. American soldiers received mail with astonishing frequency, in bulk, a flood of letters, packages, and newspapers that kept them tethered to their lives at home. The Japanese soldiers, often cut off for months or years, relied on rare, censored communications. The ease with which the American soldier maintained this connection was another display of logistical supremacy and, more importantly, a reflection of a society that placed supreme value on the individual family unit. The daily arrival of mail, even the occasional sea ration filled with homemade cookies sent from the Red Cross, was a constant, tangible reminder of the democratic contract. You fight for us, and we will support your life and connection to your home, no matter where you are. This was the antithesis of the Japanese ideal of cutting all earthly ties for the sake of imperial duty. The memory of the internment was not the memory of expected cruelty, but the memory of bewildering, casual humanity, underscored by the physical reality of an unstoppable abundance. The Japanese women, stripped of their uniforms and their national defense mechanisms, were forced to confront the truth. The Americans were not barbarians. They were simply unbeatable. The final poetic realization of this ideological collision rests in the silent testimony of the C-ration can. It had begun as a symbol of logistics, then became a marker of material abundance, and finally, it stood for the democratic promise. Its contents were standardized, guaranteeing a basic human necessity to every soldier and, by extension, every person under its system's control. It was the material reflection of the statement, "All men are created equal," a promise of provision that transcended the battlefield. The can was democracy in a tin, reliable, egalitarian, and overflowing. The experience of the Japanese women POWs became a silent internal revolution. They had been taught that their empire's spiritual fortitude would defeat the enemy's materialism. Instead, they found that the material reality of the American system, the endless supplies, the regulated care, the casual laughter was the very expression of its superior, more humane spirit. The confidence that permitted the laughter was born from the security of the abundance. The capacity for kindness came from a system that valued the life of the individual soldier too highly to subject him to arbitrary want or fear. As the war drew to its agonizing close, and the world shifted from conflict to occupation and reconstruction, the lessons of the Manila camps endured. The Japanese women, who had anticipated the victor's scorn, instead encountered the victor's tolerance and professionalism. This transformative experience planted the seed of a new understanding, that freedom is not merely a political concept, but a powerful, tangible force, manifesting itself in everything from the right to express joy, laughter, to the ability to provide without limit. The C-ration, the defeated witnessed the profound, undeniable truth. The ideology of scarcity, fear, and suppression was ultimately no match for the abundance of a free society. The small, mundane acts, the sharing of a cigarette, the meticulous dressing of a wound, the simple, cheerful noise of a guard's conversation had done what no amount of propaganda could undo. They had revealed that the true measure of a nation's strength is not the intensity of its zealotry, but the depth of its compassion and the capacity of its systems to support the dignity of every person, even those designated as the enemy. The war was over, and the enduring echo was not the sound of a gun, but the bewildering, unforgettable sound of American laughter in the shadow of victory.